good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are today. Thank you so much for joining today's webcast. I'm Chris Hines, the Senior Manager here at Zscaler for Zscaler Private Access. We're joined today with a special guest, our CIO, Patrick Foxhoven. So Patrick, thank you so much for joining our presentation today. Today what we'll be doing is discussing our new solution, ZPA for Azure, but really it's about how do we provide secure remote access to applications that have migrated from the data center and now run within Azure, giving users the experience that they're looking for while at the same time delivering security that IT needs. So first, what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about who we are. Who is Zscaler? And really, today we are the largest cloud security platform in the world, right? And what does that mean? Right? So right now, today we process about 35 billion daily requests. We are spread across 185 countries and have over 100 data centers, right? So really leveraging that idea of cloud scale. In terms of customers, we have about 2,700 enterprise customers today. As you can see, I'm sure you recognize some of the logos there in the middle. There's about 80 of the Fortune 500. And of course, we recognize the importance of our global partners like AT&T, like Tata, B&T, and Orange as well. So a couple weeks back was Microsoft Ignite. Several of you in the audience today might have actually been at the show, and it was a phenomenal show. One of the big things, at least for Zscaler, was the fact that we announced a new solution that we had built with Microsoft called Zscaler Private Access for Azure. And really the goal here is to both accelerate and simplify the application transformation from apps moving from the data center to the Azure cloud, and do it in a really simplified way that still provides that secure remote access that enterprise teams require. And here I've actually included a quote that I really like to call out from the Vice President of Corporate for Microsoft Azure Networking, Yusuf Khalidi. So Zscaler helps to simplify the enterprise journey to Microsoft Azure for both public and hybrid environments. Zscaler Private Access gives users the choice and the benefit of secure connectivity. Again, just showing that Microsoft and Zscaler together have built a solution, and just showing the alliance that we have with the company going forward. What I want to do now is take a bit of a story and look back at history and kind of where we've come from. From a security perspective, we've very much relied on this concept of the secure perimeter, right? Some folks might, in some cases refer to this as the castle remote security architecture, but really the thought is we have a hard shell on the outside, right? We can secure the network by building this hardened perimeter or crust around it, and then have our applications hosted within that. And kind of in the modern day world now, people have kind of seen that as almost some folks kind of the M&M approach, where you have this hardened shell on the outside, but on the inside, right, once the user has access, they can kind of move around laterally to those applications themselves. All right, but this was really kind of the initial thought around how do we provide security from a network perspective. Now, from a network architecture standpoint, there was this concept of, and still is today, and several of the folks within this audience probably leverage this as well, right, this concept of the traditional hub and spoke model, where you have a main data center or headquarters location where you're actually hosting your internal applications. Then you have your branch offices that exist maybe globally or spread throughout the world, and what you're actually doing is backhauling all that traffic to the main data center and then hairpinning it back out to those locations. All right, why is this convenient? Because you can host all of your internal applications in a single place, right, and have your branch offices connect into that. But an interesting thing has changed, right? Because now internal applications like SAP that once existed solely in the data center are now migrating to the cloud, specifically Azure. Right? And that changes things dynamically. In fact, more than 40% of enterprises today are actually running applications within Azure, which is that's multiple points up from last year. So we're seeing this massive adoption of Azure, and more of these applications that once existed in the data center have now moved to Azure itself. Now this creates a bit of a change, right? Because when you look at remote users who are looking to access these applications that once existed in the data center, what are we doing today? And in most cases, most enterprise teams are relying on something called the Remote Access VPN. And let's take a look at kind of what that looks like from a remote user perspective and from a user experience. So first off, you need to build the connection between your local data center and Azure. But from a remote user standpoint, what you're forcing user traffic to do is be routed through the data center through some kind of VPN gateway, which consists of multiple appliances, things like a global load balancer, or you might be looking at a RAS, or remote access VPN, internal firewall, internal load balancer. You got to be able to protect against DDoS, right? So you have some kind of DDoS appliance that may be hosted there as well as internal firewalls, right? So the user traffic is actually routed through these internal gateways, traverses the site to that VPN, and then accesses Azure, and then trombones back throughout. Now, from a remote user standpoint, that is not the best experience, right? And I want to be clear in this, right? So this is focused on the remote user. And what's key to that, in a world where the remote user has a growing kind of say in terms of the technology that's pushed upon them, you want to make sure we're providing the right experience for those. Why? Is because in many cases, when using a remote access VPN, this is how remote employees feel when they're looking to access those internal applications, especially now that they've moved to cloud, given the fact that that experience, right, and the traffic has to route through an even longer path itself, which is obviously suboptimal. So what I want to do is talk about some of the key transformations that have taken place and that have really forced us to relook at how we're going to provide secure remote access and have really driven it to this kind of evolution that we'll talk about today with Zscaler Private Access for Azure. And the first thing to really dig into is we look at the application location. I talked about before, right, in the world where you had the castle mode architecture, you had the hub and spoke networking architecture, is because the applications existed solely within the data center. Now, with the adoption of cloud and Azure, those applications, in many cases, have moved to the cloud. From a networking perspective, the hub and spoke model has changed. Right now, we have the ability to go direct to cloud via this new solution that, again, we'll talk about. From a security standpoint, the castle mode architecture, again, where you're building the secure perimeter around applications that exist, internal applications that exist within your data center, now we're able to provide direct user to application access based on specific policies that are hosted in the cloud. Okay, and these are some really, really big transformations that are taking place that we wanted to make sure we called out. So, what is really the ideal scenario now? So here at the bottom, we have our remote user. We have the applications hosted in Azure. And the goal here, and what we want to provide and what we believe in, is this concept of remote access in the modern era, a modern cloud era, right, where you can provide direct-to-cloud access for a remote user and provide a better user experience for that individual. Something that is faster because it leverages a more optimal data path, where you can leverage things like local breakouts and route traffic to the closest location of that application. It's simpler to implement, given the fact that it's leveraging cloud versus this appliance-based and data center-centric mentality as well, and the ability to provide better sense of security. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second and why we're able to improve the security from a remote access standpoint today. And some of the benefits that we've already seen our customer reviews are things like experience. And we talk about experience, this is really much about the user experience itself, right? It's widely known that the remote access VPN is not the ideal thing for a user. They have to fire up the VPN each time they want to log into an application, right? From a security standpoint, putting users on the network, right, with a remote access VPN obviously has some serious ramifications from a risk standpoint. From a cost standpoint, the no longer needing the ability to leverage this appliances-based mentality. We have to go out and we have to purchase them, we have to deploy them, install them, and manage them. And of course, the simplicity as well, which we'll showcase with where Patrick Fox will talk a little bit more about our solution. And our real answer to this and how these teams are getting these enterprise benefits and this kind of direct-to-cloud access is something called Zscaler Private Access. For those of you who have never heard of this product, this is a service delivered from Zscaler that provides secure remote access to internal applications. And those applications can be running in the cloud or they can be running in the data center itself. right? We believe that this represents the evolution of remote access today to internal applications. The way that it's built is upon 4 key design tenets that we believe differentiates Zscaler Private Access from any other service in the market today. The first thing, and it's super, super important, is the fact that we believe that today remote access should be done in a way that connects users to specific applications without exposing them to the actual network. This means that the user should never be given access to the network when accessing internal applications. The second key tenet in which Zscaler Private Access was built is the fact that we don't actually want to expose applications or IP addresses to the internet. Why? Because we want to have a least privileged access mechanism and really, really reduce the attack surface itself, right? Only folks who have applications or access to a specific application should even be able to see it. Otherwise, to us, that should remain invisible. The third concept is that we want to be able to make this simple and use policies that are hosted in the cloud to do segmentation based on the application level versus requiring network admins to go out and have to segment by network itself. Why? Because that's complex, that takes time, that's difficult. We want to be able to make it simple as possible for the users and for our customers. And the fourth piece is that we want to be able to do this, right? Provide this secure remote access without the need for any kind of appliance. Because to us, we believe that a reliance on appliances is costly and it's ineffective, okay? What I'd like to do at this point is introduce our CIO, Patrick Foxhoven, who's going to talk more about ZPA and also be showing a live demo of the solution itself. So, let me pass the ball over to Patrick.
Thanks, Chris.
Great, and you're up and running, Patrick.
Thanks, Chris. So let me give you a deeper view of exactly what it is that we're doing with private access and how it works. So I'm going to walk you through the network diagram on the right a little bit. So it starts with, at the bottom, with the Zscaler app. So this is a piece of software. It's very lightweight. It's not meant to be very heavy, and it'll coexist with other solutions that you may have, even from a remote or application access perspective. And the app is running on, we release it on iOS and Android and Windows and Mac, so all the major platforms that the end users are going to be connecting to, the app is supported on. And what we're doing in the end is doing a very strong sense of we're making applications accessible ubiquitously. So we have to have a very strong sense of authentication and trust of the end user. So the app is living on the user's devices to do basically 2 things. One, to authenticate them very strongly, and I'll cover what we're doing there in a moment. And then 2, provide a mechanism for us to, in essence, intercept the traffic that needs to go through private access and then break out to either an application that may be in something like Azure, or break out to an application on an on-prem data center. So that's what the app is doing. It's authenticating the user strongly, and then it's providing the traffic interception capability. And then on the other end of the diagram, we have what's called a Z connector. That's at the top of the diagram here. And basically that is meant to sit right next to wherever your applications are. Wherever they exist, that's where you would deploy a Z connector. And I'll show you a screenshot here in a moment. That's something that you can install in 1 or 2 clicks from the Azure Marketplace. If it's an on-prem data center, you can download a prepackaged virtual machine that's ready to go. You can even get it as a software package and run it on an existing server. If you need more capacity or you want redundancy, you just turn on a second connector or a third. They will auto-scale. You don't have to do anything in your network to make them work or distribute load or put load balancers or anything. That'll all happen inherently. You just need to turn on the second or third or however many connectors you want, and that's it. So in essence, you have the app on the bottom, you have the connector on the top, and then in the middle is our cloud service. You're going to define via our web-based portal, which I'll show you just a couple minutes of, the policies around who's allowed to go where, what applications they're allowed to access, how we're going to actually authenticate the users. You can define policies around different criteria. Give access to applications dependent on certain device postures. So you can have a policy that says this application is only going to be accessible on a corporate managed device that's on, let's say, a Windows domain as an example. That's one of many. But the policy engine is very granular. You're in control of your policy. You log in and you set that policy, and it's applied in real time on a global perspective. And then what happens is when a user tries to access an application that should be going through private access and they're authorized to get to it, all the user has to do is access it the exact same way that they would normally, as if we weren't even there. The user experience is pretty radically improved because there is no notion of the user having to be on the VPN or off the VPN or do something different depending on the network location that they're at. They just access the application whenever they would or however they would normally, and private access is going to, in essence, do the very secure dynamic connectivity. Brokering is a good concept to think of it. That's why we call it brokers in the middle, where we're basically dynamically stitching together user to application connectivity, but in a way that is far more secure than it's been done previously, in a way that follows the 4 key tenets that Chris just outlined, where we're keeping applications invisible. This entire solution will work without a single inbound firewall policy anywhere. No inbound firewall policies required to the connector, obviously to the user as well, and it's a very modern way of in essence, brokering or stitching connections together. And to kind of zoom in on what that looks like in terms of some of the benefits, I'll jump to that in just a moment, but I also wanted to highlight our partnership with Azure, which is the fact that what we did and what we announced at Ignite 2 weeks ago is we basically extended our cloud environment for ZPA into Azure. So what this means in the end is customers that have applications that are deployed in Azure, when we are brokering the traffic flows between the users and the applications, that traffic can stay within Azure and never even break out to the public internet, even through our network. It's staying on Microsoft's Azure cloud infrastructure and their backbones. And in essence, what we're talking about is we've ran or deployed our brokers within Azure for customers to use. There's nothing that you have to do differently to take advantage of this. This is going to be handled automatically by our cloud when we determine where users and applications need to meet. And so that's why it's thought of purely as an extension of our cloud into Azure. We've always been able to run the connectors in Azure from the beginning. We've also always been integrated with things like Azure Active Directory and conditional access. But the big announcement was we're now also running a part of our cloud within Azure, which for you as the end user, the benefits are, traffic that is going to Azure remains within Azure, and it can enable all kinds of other additional scenarios with Azure, especially with things around local breakouts. And when it's partnered with our Zscaler Internet Access offering, it can be very revolutionary to how Office 365 and even other Microsoft properties, even outside Azure, end up operating. So here's a deeper view of how we're kind of tackling the 4 key tenets with this solution. And I'm going to start on the bottom left with point number 1, which is when we're doing this kind of solution in private access, this is never putting the user on the remote network. And to take a step back, when we were designing this offering 3.5, 4 years ago now, we didn't want to do this remote access or application access capability the same way it's been done for the last 10 or 15 years. I would argue that IPsec-based VPNs and SSL-based VPNs and the way they've worked were never really originally designed for users to get access to applications. They were really designed to provide, 2 networks to come together and interconnect them. And they haven't changed. Chris showed the crazy diagram with traffic that is coming into an environment and doing U-turns and what I kind of call traffic tromboning back and forth, and how not elegant that solution is. And so that's why we wanted to do something that was radically different that follows these 4 key tenets. It's pretty radically different when you're saying you're never giving the user an IP address on the remote network. And that has all kinds of benefits. From a security perspective, we've all seen what happens when, let's say, a user is connecting to a network that also then is connected to, let's say, a point-of-sale processing network in a famous retail breach that happened in the last few years. There's all kinds of risks that happen when you put the user on that network and traffic potentially having the ability to move laterally around in that environment. In ZPA, we actually never even resolve the real IP address to the end user. Even when they're authorized to connect to that application, they get a fictitious address, which is, one, important from a security perspective because, you know, they're not able to communicate or even be able to map out a network. But two, that's providing some of the segmentation benefits that I'll cover in a future point. So, number two, we keep things invisible to unauthorized users, and that's not only from, you know, your users in your environment, keeping sensitive resources hidden from them or invisible from them, but that's also keeping your network invisible from the internet itself. This is borrowing on concepts of what the military calls darknet capability. It's think of it as, like Chris mentioned, it's keeping things invisible when they don't have access to it. And what we mean in private access, what we're actually doing is an IP address will not even resolve at the DNS level. You won't even get an IP address out of whatever request you're making unless that user has been fully authorized and authenticated and permitted. A policy lookup has already happened that they're permitted to access that application. Only then will you actually be able to even resolve an IP address. Point number three is policy-based access to specific apps. So naturally, you'll see in our demo that I'll break to here in just a moment, it's very user and application aware. We're not, because things like IP addresses don't matter, we're not doing anything that would be at a lower level, which is where a lot of other application and remote access solutions end up playing. You'll see how we define policies and even how we report back on what traffic flows, what users are accessing, what applications in your organization. How we report back on that is very different, and I would argue a lot more modern. And then the last piece is the internet is the secure network. It's in some cases becoming the new corporate network, but in essence, you can use a solution like this without having to trust us as a third party providing the service too much. You can actually have, we knew when we were designing this that some of the most sensitive traffic flows in your network were going to be flowing through this. These are going to be users accessing, you know, some of the most private applications, and so we had to design this in a way where you don't have to, you know, trust us too much. It's a trust no one encryption model where, in essence, you can deploy your own certificates to your end users' devices. You deploy your own certificates to your connectors. You never give us, as the, you know, cloud service provider, you never have to give us the private keys. So all the traffic that's flowing through us is cryptographically speaking impossible for us to decrypt. And we think that's very important when you're talking about, you know, moving very sensitive applications to a, you know, a cloud-delivered internet-based service like private access. I mentioned that we have been already running in Azure from the connectors perspective, as well as from having integration with Azure Active Directory. And so here's screenshots showing if you are an Azure customer today, you can go to the marketplaces and in 1 or 2 clicks, not only in Active Directory's case, deploy configuration that's going to integrate authentication with private access, but in the connector's case, actually start the connector up within your VNet is what Azure calls it, or you know, within whatever regions or where you have applications deployed. And other than having the end user install the app, you're up and running. That's all it takes to start utilizing the service. And I would be remiss to not cover that while we're focusing the topic of this webinar on Azure, this is obviously a great way for users and devices to access applications that have migrated to Azure without, you know, the traffic tromboning and U-turning kind of scenarios. This is also very relevant and is the same solution that you can use to deploy to access applications that may be in your corporate or internal data centers as well, off to the right of Azure. We see this as being very relevant because it can actually provide, from the end user's perspective, you know, a ubiquitous experience. They don't have to do anything different when they're accessing something in Azure versus on the corporate network versus in a corporate data center. Wherever they are across whatever devices they're on, their user experience doesn't have to be any different. They just access the applications, and in the end, behind the scenes, they're doing so in a much more secure manner. So with that, let me break out a PowerPoint for just a few moments, and I'll just show you 2 or 3 minutes of a quick demo of what private access looks like from a couple perspectives, just to give you a little bit more visibility to what's actually happening here. And then I promise I'll come back and we wanted to reserve about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A. So just a couple-minute quick peek. So let me show first from the administrative user's perspective. So I'm going to log in as the IT head of Zscaler. And so this is our live production cloud. There's nothing canned about this. This is actually Zscaler's production environment and our corporate environment, excuse me. And right out of the gate, you'll see that we are surfacing not IP addresses and protocols, TCP ports and UDP ports and things that if you compare this to an existing application access or remote access solution, it looks very different out of the gate. Right out of the box, we are very application-centric and very user-centric. And so at a high level, we can discover applications that exist in an organization's environment because a lot of times companies don't have a good handle around what applications actually exist internally. This concept of shadow IP, I think, is not just for external applications that are hosted on the internet, but it's also very relevant for applications that are within an environment. So we will discover applications that you may not know you have already and pop them up and then allow you to, for example, one-click define policies around these discovered applications and then make them become sanctioned apps as one example workflow of many. Not only are we surfacing what applications are there, but we're saying, what applications are in use the most. So here you'll see, in Zscaler's internal network, Jira is a development tool that we use. We've got printers, we've got podcast infrastructure, we've got all kinds of HipChat that's an internal instance. We've got all kinds of internal applications. I can click on, say, Jira. Anywhere in this UI, you can click to drill in. So I can say, show me everything that's hitting Jira now. And here you see an example of what user is connecting to Jira, all the details around, how much traffic is flowing. I can even pivot. So I'm seeing just a transaction log view. I can pivot, and I can actually graph traffic to Jira in real time. And usually it's a busy enough application that when I'm doing a demo, we'll see. So there's 3 access attempts to Jira. We're graphing them. I can actually view, which users are accessing Jira at which time, where those users are coming from. And that same concept of starting at a high level and drilling in can happen anywhere in the UI. If I go to our user dashboard and I end up picking on, any user, here's the most active users right now in the last 24 hours. And again, this can be a custom time frame. I can drill in to say, I'll pick on Sam and my team, and I can see that he's accessing 19 apps. And I can drill in, and I can see the same live view of Sam. I can graph his events in real time. We can go back to the dashboard, and from a health perspective, because what we're doing in ZPA is making and discovering applications and servers and infrastructure, we have a great view of, by default, we surface things that are down or may have a problem, but then we can also see all the things that are up and running. And so we quickly realized that to do what we're doing in private access, we have to not only discover where servers are, where applications are, but then we have to know how healthy they are and how fast they're performing. And so we found that, when you deploy connectors in your network, as they start understanding where this traffic is flowing, we have a great perspective to actually visualize what's happening in your environment. So here, you'll see we have connectors deployed in Azure, we have them deployed in AWS and corporate in our on-prem environments, and I can actually view, here's the connector, here's the applications and the servers it's discovered, here's the details about the applications. I can do it in very large environments, so one of our corporate offices has a very large set of infrastructure. You'll see this scales to, networks of any size. And I can even visually see that the yellow lines are applications that may be up or down, the green lines are good, red lines are bad, and I can continue to pivot and move around this diagram. So very powerful, rich environment from a administration UI perspective. And then I also wanted to show what the end user perspective is. So when an end user is using this solution, the only thing that they have to do is have the Z app already installed and enrolled in the solution. There is no concept of logging in or out anymore. If I go up to my menu icon here and I bring up this icon, here's the Zscaler app. You'll see it is connected, part of private access. It's also the same client for our internet security offerings. So if my internet traffic is going out direct as well, I am getting all the benefits of the Zscaler internet access protection. But as an end user, I don't ever have to see that. I just access applications the way I always would. So for example, I mentioned that we use Jira. As long as I have private access running, which it'll always run in the background, I can type in Jira, and this is the exact same address if I was on the corporate network versus off. I guarantee we don't have this exposed to the internet, and private access just makes it work ubiquitously. And we don't just stop with web applications. A lot of companies that have products in the software-defined perimeter space is what I think the market is calling some of these notions. They are web only. we're not just web. We can basically run, you know, any port or protocol. So here's something like Active Directory going to a domain controller, and it's going to work going through ZPA just fine, as if, you know, as just another example of a non-web-only application. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a feel from both the admin UI, administrator perspective, and then the end user's experience on how private access is working. And with that, I think we wanted to reserve some time for some Q&A. I'll turn it back over to Chris.
Absolutely. Thank you, Patrick, for that in-depth take about the architecture, the deep dive into the integrations that we have with Azure, and of course the demo. So as you can see, the amount of visibility and admin and really security that any network admin or security admin can provide is pretty awesome, especially when you look at kind of where secure remote access has been in the past and kind of where it's evolved to with Zscaler Private Access and more of this kind of software-defined perimeter approach as well. So at this time, as Patrick said, we'd like to kind of open up the floor. So let me take a look at the Q&A portal that we have here. We have a bunch of questions that have come in, Patrick. Let's see. Okay, so one question is from Ken. How to manage data so remote users don't keep data local, but want to save data at a data center, but not take time to save or get the data itself?
Yeah, so this is not the be-all, end-all solution for everything, all security around remote access. This is meant to plug into an existing framework that you would have, and usually where that ends up coming into play is you will likely, you know, I think any great deployment around securing these end users' machines starts with something like a mobile device NMDM platform, or starts with, you know, some kind of system governance, whether it's, you know, something simple like Active Directory and group policy, or, you know, something more evolved with a full MDM platform from, you know, an AirWatch or a Mobile Iron or Intune of the world, in Azure's case, that you have to have basic governance of that device. And when you have that, those tools are much more suited for trying to govern, you know, what data can exist. Is it encrypted? You know, when you're talking about data governance, are you allowed to plug in USB drives or other things? We're basically providing the access infrastructure. We're also being able to provide, you know, the posture of the device and detail around the users, and on the back end, on the server side, giving you visibility into who's accessing what data. But this will plug in and become very complementary with an existing NDM or device management policy to go where I think the question was leading into, which is when a user downloads something or, you know, takes data through private access, then how do you govern what you're allowed to do with it, or if you're allowed to copy or paste it, or things like that. You know, a very common use case is a iPhone or a, you know, an Android device. You know, MDMs have been able to enforce copy and paste restrictions, you know, from the beginning. So things like that, we end up being very complementary with the existing MDM.
Oh, no, thank you, Patrick. Another question we got, and I can take this one, is can we use Okta authentication for users? And the answer to that is absolutely. We integrate with Okta SSO as well as a few other single sign-on providers. So if you're using Okta for your authentication today, you can absolutely use Okta authentication and ZPA together. Another question we got is, many customers have applications in Azure, AWS, and GCP. Can we use ZPA from Azure to connect to other clouds? So, Patrick, you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So when we were designing ZPA, this was all about how a user gets access to applications. So ZPA today would absolutely allow you as an organization to deploy apps in multiple clouds. So let's say Azure and AWS as an example, and Google Cloud Compute, multiple infrastructure as a service providers. And if you deploy connectors for ZPA, where those applications are, from the end user's perspective, they're going to be able to access any of those apps at any time, regardless of what cloud they're on. ZPA really makes things like network and location and IP address be irrelevant, and in essence provides kind of ubiquitous access wherever they are. So ZPA will absolutely enable that from a user to application perspective. ZPA would not be from, let's say, server to server or cloud to cloud, where you would be talking about what some would call east-west traffic, so traffic is flowing from one cloud to another. that's like machine to machine or server to server, that would not be what ZPA would be helping with. It would be focused on the user side.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Another question we got was, can users log in to Zscaler Private Access from multiple devices, for example, iPhone, laptop, iPad, at the same time?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, of course, because we knew that, you know, many users would be logging in from, you know, laptops and phones and tablets, and so this was always designed from the beginning to allow that to happen. If you wanted to control or lock that down, where you didn't want multiple simultaneous logins to happen, that is possible too via policy, but you know, out of the box, that's a normal behavior. And you'll see that when we do the reporting, we'll attribute, you know, user traffic across all their devices properly in a way that, you know, you would want. But then we also do give you the visibility. If you go to the mobile side of our portal and you let's say focusing on one particular user, you then can break that out and say, here's the devices that the user has, and obviously report on it on a device-by-device basis as well.
Great, and I can take this question. There's another question coming. Is something similar coming for AWS and GCP? Or at least I can address part of it. Patrick, do you have an answer to that as well? So I'll say that, you know, we're working with AWS as well as GCP. The level of integrations that we have with Azure and kind of AWS and GCP might differ initially, but we're absolutely exploring those options and working with both of those cloud service providers to make sure that we're simplifying this app transformation to those cloud providers as much as possible.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on to that is the level of integration is basically, you know, the one-click style integration. That'll vary. But Zscaler Private Access does already exist in, say, the AWS marketplace. Not in the Google Cloud Compute marketplace today, but it is already in AWS, and we do have customers that are using ZPA in these multi-cloud environments just fine. There's no technical limitations.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Another question we got from Petri was, can we use Azure VPN instead, ExpressRoute connecting in-house DC? So one thing, especially around the ExpressRoute, I think it's important to call out. We imagine that the ZPA and things like ExpressRoute can work in parallel, right? So typically what we've seen is that for headquarters offices or branch offices that are looking to connect directly to Azure data centers, they'll leverage ExpressRoute. From a remote access standpoint, especially given kind of the diagrams we showed around kind of how traditional remote access is done today, what they would then use is Zscaler Private Access from the remote access standpoint for the remote users, and then leverage something like an ExpressRoute for the site-to-site connect from, let's say, a headquarters office directly to an Azure data center or a branch office to an Azure data center. And in some cases, from a remote office standpoint, they might actually choose to leverage Zscaler Private Access as well, so they don't have to deal with some of the additional kind of complications that could come out of requiring multiple site-to-sites or whatever it might be from multiple branch office locations, which could be, cost could be an impediment to that. Patrick, any thoughts or additional thoughts around that question?
No, that's great. You covered everything I would have said.
Cool. I think that covers all the questions that we got. Are there any more questions that have come in from the audience? Again, happy to discuss this further if you guys like. You can always reach out to us at Zscaler anytime if you'd like, the LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever it might be. I think what we can do now is, Patrick, I think there's a closing slide that we just want to hit on. If you can progress the slide.
Yep.
Great. So just kind of in closing here, as I don't see any more questions coming in. So if you are interested in learning more about Zscaler, specifically Zscaler for Azure, we've included the website link here on the right, zscaler.com/product/ZPA for Azure. We also have additional webcasts coming up. The next one being Lessons for Thriving, Not Just Surviving in the Cloud, and that's going to be presented by our CEO, Jay Chowdhury. So again, thank you so much to each and every one of you for taking the time to learn about how to provide secure remote access to applications in Azure with ZPA. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Patrick, for your leadership, for the awesome presentation, and I'm happy to have you here.
Thanks, Chris. You too.
All right, everyone. Thank you. Good night, good afternoon, and good evening.